That late afternoon, as I was tidying up my bedroom, I heard the creak of the door behind me. Turning around, I saw Ethan standing there in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the object in my hands. My breath hitched. How on earth could I explain that what I was holding was, at best, awkward to be caught with? It was a massive, brightly colored toy, impossible to ignore or casually explain away. I had absent-mindedly pulled it out of the drawer while trying to clean behind the cabinet, never expecting to have an audience. I was sure I had fixed the squeaky door. Ethan, my 23-year-old stepson, wasn't supposed to be home yet. He worked at a nearby brewery and usually hung out with his friends until late after his shifts. But there he was, tall and lean, his dark hair falling into his piercing blue eyes, which now glimmered with amusement. "What's that?" he asked, his voice teetering between teasing and curious. My face burned as I dropped the thing like it was red hot, scrambling to grab the nearest throw pillow to hide it. "It's none of your business," I muttered, my throat tight as if it might choke on my words. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned casually against the doorframe, his interest clearly growing. "You don't need to be embarrassed," he said, chuckling softly. "I mean, I get it. We've all been there." His nonchalance only made me wish the floor would open up and swallow me whole. Who had the nerve to stand there so calm and collected, while I was drowning in mortification? Forcing a nervous laugh, I tried to brush him off. "Ethan, seriously, just worry about yourself. You're not even supposed to be here." But he didn't budge. The silence that followed was suffocating, the air between us thick enough to cut. His eyes left the pillow in my hands and landed on me instead, and something in his expression shifted. Gone was the usual easygoing or joking demeanor I was used to. This look was something else entirely, intense, unyielding, as if he were seeing me in a way he never had before. It made me uncomfortable, like he'd peeled back a layer of my identity I hadn't meant to share. A warmth flickered in my chest, quickly replaced by a sharp pang of guilt. This was wrong. Deeply, undeniably wrong. I was his stepmother, for heaven's sake. I was married to his father. I broke the tension with a laugh that sounded far too forced. Ethan shrugged, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough," he said casually, though his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary before he finally left. As the door clicked shut behind him, I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the pillow to my chest as if it could shield me from the storm of emotions swirling inside me. My heart pounded as I stared at the drawer, unable to put the item back. Something had shifted between us, something small but undeniable, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, I knew I would never look at Ethan the same way again. The rest of the evening dragged by in a haze. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, and sat next to Victor on the couch while he absent-mindedly flipped through old westerns on TV. But Ethan's smirk and the unsettling gleam in his eyes replayed in my mind like a broken record. Victor didn't seem to notice my distraction. Not that it mattered. He'd been wrapped up in his hobbies, gardening, woodworking, crossword puzzles, for years now, ever since retiring. I didn't resent him for it. That would have been too simple. But sometimes I felt more like his live-in nurse than his wife. Later, I caught sight of Ethan's shadow moving across the hall as he passed by his room. The faint thrum of bass-heavy music filtered through his door, a jarring contrast to the otherwise quiet house. For some reason it sent a jolt through me. I glanced over at Victor, who was now dozing in his recliner, his chin slumped to his chest while the TV droned on. I thought about waking him but quickly decided against it. Instead, I wandered into the kitchen for a moment of solitude. But my peace didn't last long. Ethan appeared, his bare feet soundless on the hardwood floor. He was dressed casually in an old t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair a mess like he'd just run his fingers through it. "Hey," he said, grabbing a water bottle from the fridge. "You're up late," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Could say the same about you," he replied with a small smile, leaning against the counter. "Just unwinding," he added, shrugging. "It's not easy being in this house sometimes." That made me pause. "What do you mean?" He shrugged again, but this time there was something heavier in his expression. "Nothing really. Just living here again, you know? It's weird. Like I don't belong anymore." Despite myself, I felt a pang of concern, maternal almost. "It's just temporary, Ethan. You'll figure things out. You're smart and capable. You'll land on your feet." Thanks, he said, his voice softer now. For a moment we stood there in silence, the space between us somehow shrinking though neither of us moved. His eyes met mine, and that same flicker of warmth returned, uninvited and unwelcome. I cleared my throat, grabbing a towel to wipe down the counter in a desperate attempt to break whatever was happening. But Ethan wasn't done. About earlier, he began, his tone turning playful again. You don't need to feel embarrassed, you know? We're all human, Ethan said casually, his voice cutting through the quiet. My hand froze mid-wipe and I turned to face him, forcing myself to stay composed. Ethan, let's just drop it, all right? It was an accident and there's no point bringing it up again, I replied firmly, hoping to end the conversation. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender, though the teasing edge in his grin made my stomach flip uncomfortably. He strolled past me, close enough for me to catch a faint whiff of his cologne, earthy with a hint of something sweet. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel the heat of his presence lingering behind me for a moment before he finally exited the kitchen. That night, as I lay next to Victor in bed, my thoughts spiraled. What was happening to me, to us, to this house? I'd always been firm about maintaining boundaries that were never meant to be crossed, but Ethan had a knack for pushing them, intentionally or not. And the worst part? I wasn't entirely sure I wanted him to stop. The next morning I tried to stick to my usual routine. I made breakfast as I always did, eggs, toast, and coffee for Victor and a smoothie for myself. Ethan came into the kitchen last, as he often did, his damp hair still tousled from a shower. He greeted Victor with a casual morning, but when he turned to me, his smile was warm, almost intimate. My pulse quickened in response, though I tried to ignore it. The three of us sat at the table, the clinking of silverware and small talk filling the air. But underneath it all I could sense the tension. Every time Ethan's hand brushed mine as we passed the salt or the coffee pot, it felt deliberate. More than once I caught him watching me, his gaze steady and unreadable. Victor, of course, remained oblivious, absorbed in his meal. After breakfast, Ethan offered to help clean up, a rare gesture from him. Usually he'd disappear into his room or head out to meet friends, so his offer caught me off guard. You don't have to, I said, stacking plates in the sink. I want to, he replied simply, already grabbing a dish towel. We worked in silence for a while, but the atmosphere between us was anything but calm. At one point I reached for a glass at the same time he did, and our hands collided. For a second, neither of us pulled away. You're different, he said quietly, almost as if he hadn't meant to speak aloud. What do you mean? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I don't know. You're not like other women your age. I let out a nervous laugh and took a step back, trying to put some space between us. Well, that's flattering, I said lightly, hoping to steer the conversation somewhere safer. It's not just that, he continued, his tone more serious now. You're real. You actually listen to people. You see them. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond, so I turned back to the dishes, scrubbing furiously. But even with my back to him, I could feel his presence, close, unyielding. My heart raced again, and I hated how much I wanted him to stay right there. Before I could gather my thoughts, Victor's voice called from the living room. Clara, where's my crossword book? The moment shattered and Ethan stepped back, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. I'll let you get back to him, he said lightly, his tone playful again as he walked away. I felt an overwhelming mix of relief and longing. I knew I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, but some part of me couldn't resist leaning closer to the fire. Later that afternoon, I kept myself busy running errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But when I returned, I found Ethan sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the yard. He looked different, less confident, more pensive. Hey, I said softly as I approached. He glanced up and gave me a small smile. Hey, everything okay? I asked, sitting down a few feet away from him, careful to keep a safe distance. He hesitated before answering. Yeah, just thinking. About what? He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the grass. Life, I guess. Where I'm going. Where I'm supposed to be going. You're young, Ethan. You don't have to have it all figured out yet, I said, hoping to reassure him. Maybe, he murmured, still not meeting my gaze. After a moment, he added, "Do you ever feel like you're stuck in the wrong story? Like you're meant for something else?" His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I wanted to tell him everything would be fine, to offer some comfort, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Instead, I placed a hand on his shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You're not trapped," I said softly, praying he wouldn't hear the tremor in my voice. For a brief moment he covered my hand with his. The gesture felt far too intimate, and I quickly pulled away, my heart pounding. Another line crossed. Another boundary blurred. And I wasn't sure I had the strength to pull it back anymore. That evening the sky darkened with an oncoming storm, the air heavy and charged with anticipation. Victor went to bed early, complaining of his aching shoulder, leaving me alone in the living room with a book in hand. But I couldn't focus. The storm outside mirrored the one inside me. Restless, unpredictable, dangerous. From the kitchen, I heard the faint clink of glass and the low hum of the fridge door closing. Moments later, Ethan appeared in the doorway, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. "Want one?" he asked, lifting an eyebrow. I blinked, caught off guard. "I don't usually drink this late." "Well, maybe tonight's an exception," he said with a grin, placing the glass in my hand without waiting for an answer. I hesitated but eventually took the cool glass, pressing it against my palm. Ethan sank into the armchair across from me, stretching out his legs like he owned the room. The soft glow of the lamp beside me cast shadows across his face, accentuating the sharp lines of his jaw and the faint stubble on his chin. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. "Just something light," I replied, holding it up briefly. "Nothing exciting." He smirked. "I find that hard to believe." I laughed softly, taking a small sip of the whiskey. It burned, but it was a welcome distraction from the tension that had been building all day. For a while we sat in silence, the sound of rain and distant thunder filling the room. Then his voice broke through, low and careful. "Can I ask you something?" I looked at him warily. "Depends on what it is." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze fixed on it like he was trying to gather his thoughts. "Do you ever feel stuck?" Ethan asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. The question caught me off guard, though it felt strangely familiar. Similar to what he'd asked earlier on the porch, but now it carried a deeper weight. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. He looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. "You don't seem like someone who should be stuck. You're too alive for that." The heat rose in my cheeks and I quickly looked away, setting my glass down on the coffee table as if the action could create distance. "Ethan, you shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "It's true," he said, his tone matter of fact. His words lingered in the air between us, heavy with unspoken emotions. Needing to break the tension, I stood abruptly, smoothing my hands on my jeans. "I think it's time we call it a night," I said, deliberately avoiding his gaze. Before I could leave the room, the power suddenly cut out, plunging the house into complete darkness. I froze mid-step, the unexpected blackout disorienting. "It's just the storm," I muttered, though my voice betrayed a slight tremble. "Hold on," Ethan said, his tone calm and steady. "I'll find a flashlight." I heard him stand, the soft shuffle of his feet against the carpet growing closer. "Just stay still," he murmured again, his voice near enough to send a shiver down my spine. I felt the faint rustle of his sleeve brush against me, and then, his hand accidentally grazed mine in the dark. I sucked in a sharp breath at the contact. "Sorry," he whispered, though he didn't move his hand away. Instead, it lingered, warm and deliberate, his touch igniting something I couldn't name. I stood there frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, so loud I was sure he could hear it. "Lila," he said softly, my name barely more than a breath on his lips. Even in the darkness, I instinctively turned toward him, drawn in by his closeness. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his presence, his warmth, the rhythm of his breathing steady and sure. Then, his hand slid gently up to my wrist, holding it lightly. This is a bad idea," I stammered, my voice trembling as I tried to regain control. "I know," he admitted, his tone low and steady, but he didn't release his grip. A crack of lightning illuminated the room for a fleeting moment, and in that brief flash, I saw his face, earnest, vulnerable, and impossibly close. And then he kissed me. It started soft, almost hesitant, like he was giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt like it was the only solid thing in a world spinning out of control. The light flickered back on suddenly, and we pulled apart, both of us breathing hard. Reality slammed into me and I stepped back, my hands trembling at my sides. This can't happen, I said, shaking my head, my voice breaking under the weight of my guilt. Ethan didn't argue. He just stood there, his expression calm but unreadable. I know, he said quietly, his voice steady. But the damage was done. The next few days blurred into a haze of avoidance and guilt. I threw myself into chores and errands, anything to keep my mind busy. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget. The way his lips had felt on mine, the warmth of his hand on my wrist, it played on an endless loop in my mind. One evening, as I folded laundry in the guest room, I heard the door open behind me. Turning, I saw Ethan standing there, his shoulders tense and his face unreadable. We need to talk, he said firmly, closing the door behind him. There's nothing to talk about, I replied without looking up, focusing instead on folding a towel. Yes, there is, he countered, stepping further into the room. I sighed, setting the laundry down and finally meeting his gaze. Ethan, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's wrong. Is it? He asked, his tone challenging. Because it doesn't feel wrong to me. His words sent a chill down my spine, and I forced myself to stay calm. You don't understand, I said, my voice rising slightly. If Victor ever found out. He won't, Ethan interrupted. And even if he did, do you really think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore. The sting of his words was immediate, mostly because they were true. But that didn't make them any less painful, or any less wrong. This isn't about him, I said, my voice sharper now. It's about us. About the fact that this, whatever this is, can't happen. It's not just wrong, it's impossible. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes unwavering as they locked onto mine. Why? He demanded. Because you're afraid of what people might think? Or because you're afraid of what you might think? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Lila, he continued, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. And I don't think you can either. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I quickly looked away, unwilling to let him see how much his words affected me. I don't understand, I whispered, my voice breaking. Then explain it to me, he said, his tone filled with quiet desperation. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain the war raging inside me, the guilt, the fear, the longing. So instead I shook my head, brushing past him without another word. That night sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic hum of Victor's breathing beside me. My mind was a tangled mess, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't unravel it. Finally, I gave up and slipped out of bed, heading to the kitchen for a glass of water. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Ethan's door was open, and he stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame as if he'd been waiting for me. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice low, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. I shook my head, unable to find the words. For a long moment, Ethan and I just stared at each other. The silence was heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. Then, without a word, I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door firmly behind me. But even as I lay down, I knew this wasn't the end. Whatever this was, this impossible, reckless thing between us, it wasn't going away. And the worst part? I wasn't entirely sure I wanted it to. The next time it happened, there was no storm to blame. No flickering lights to hide behind. This time it was deliberate. I was in the laundry room, pulling warm towels from the dryer, the mundane rhythm of folding them giving me some small sense of control. The house was quiet. Victor had gone to a friend's house to watch a game, and I thought I had the place to myself. Then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. Always working, Ethan said lightly, though there was a note in his voice I couldn't quite place. I didn't turn around. Someone has to, I replied, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. He chuckled softly. Fair enough. But don't you ever get tired of it? Tired of what? I asked, still focused on folding the towels. Tired of taking care of everything. Of everyone. When's the last time someone took care of you? His words sliced through me like a blade. I stopped folding, clutching a towel to my chest like it could shield me from the weight of his question. Ethan, I said, finally turning to face him. I don't think this is a conversation we should be having. Why not? He asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He looked so at ease, but his eyes told a different story. They were sharp, searching, locked onto me like he was trying to see past every wall I'd built. Because, I said, my voice faltering, it's not appropriate. Appropriate? He repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. That's not the same thing as honest, though, is it? I wanted to shut him down, to end this before it spiraled further out of control. But before I could, he stepped closer, the small space between us suddenly feeling far too intimate. You don't have to pretend with me, Lila, he said softly, his voice low and steady. I see you. The way you hold this house together, the way you carry everything while everyone else just takes. Don't you think you deserve something for yourself? My throat tightened, and I took a step back until the counter pressed into my hips. Ethan, whatever this is, it has to stop. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like the ground beneath me was shifting. Tell me you don't feel it too, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Because I couldn't tell him that. I couldn't lie to him, or to myself. And then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me. But this time I didn't pull away. The days that followed blurred into a mix of guilt and stolen moments. We thought we were being careful. Ethan found every excuse to linger near me. Offering to help with dinner, fixing a cabinet door, even volunteering to run errands. At first it felt exhilarating. A rush of adrenaline from something so forbidden. But the reality of our situation crept in like a shadow. Every time Victor looked at me, I wondered if he knew. Every time our nosy neighbor, Karen, waved at me from across the street, I felt like she could see right through me. One afternoon, as I was putting away groceries, Ethan came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I stiffened, glancing nervously toward the doorway. Ethan, stop. Victor could walk in any minute. He's at the hardware store, Ethan said, his voice calm, almost casual. But I couldn't relax. The paranoia was eating away at me, turning every glance, every whisper into a potential threat. We need to talk, I said, turning to face him. About what? He asked, his expression unreadable. About this. About us. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of frustration in his eyes. What about us? He asked, his voice edged with irritation. This has to stop, I said, forcing the words out even though they felt like they were cutting me from the inside. It's too risky. It's not fair to Victor. What about fair to you? Ethan demanded, his voice rising. What about you, Lila? Do you even hear yourself? You're so consumed with worrying about him that you're ignoring everything you need, everything you want. What I want doesn't matter. I snapped, the words spilling out before I could stop them. This isn't about me. It is about you, Ethan countered, stepping closer, his voice firm but not angry. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to be with someone who actually sees you for who you are, who makes you feel alive. His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unrelenting. I wanted to argue, to push him away, to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't. Deep down I knew he was right. Weeks passed, and the tension between us only grew. The breaking point came one evening when Victor invited Karen and her husband over for dinner. I tried my best to play the part of the perfect hostess, smiling, laughing, pouring drinks, but no matter how hard I tried, the weight of everything pressed down on me. And all the while I could feel Ethan's eyes on me, watching, waiting. No matter how hard I tried to play the part of the perfect wife, I couldn't shake the feeling that Claire's sharp, calculating gaze was fixed on me the entire evening. Every polite smile, every casual remark, felt like a probe, a silent question hanging in the air. It was as if she knew something, and the sensation made my skin crawl. After dinner, while clearing the table and rinsing the dishes in the kitchen, I felt someone step into the room behind me. I turned, startled, to find Claire standing there, her arms crossed and her eyes locked onto mine with a pointed intensity. "You've been awfully distracted lately," she said, her tone light but laced with something far more probing. "Just busy," I replied quickly, forcing a smile that felt painfully unnatural. "You know how it is." Claire tilted her head, stepping just a little closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Does Jack know?" Her words hit me like a physical blow. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. "No," I managed to whisper, barely able to form the word. Claire shrugged nonchalantly, but there was something in her eyes, something cold, something knowing. "Whatever's going on with you and Ryan." I felt the floor shift beneath me, the air knocked out of my lungs. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice trembling. Her smile was thin, calculated, and her gaze colder than I'd ever seen it. "Just be careful, Ellie," she murmured, her words heavy with warning. "Secrets have a way of coming out, whether you want them to or not." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Claire's words echoed in my mind like a haunting refrain. I felt trapped, caught between two worlds, one I had built and another I couldn't seem to escape, both on the verge of colliding in a catastrophic way. The next morning, I found refuge in the garden, bent over a patch of weeds, yanking them from the ground with far more force than necessary. My hands trembled with the weight of my thoughts, my mind racing in circles I couldn't escape. "You're avoiding me." Ryan's voice came from behind me, calm but carrying an edge of frustration. "I'm trying to protect us," I replied without turning, my tone distant, cold. "Protect us from what?" he asked, stepping closer, his expression unreadable. "From this blowing up in our faces," I said, standing up abruptly and wiping my dirty hands on my jeans. I finally met his eyes, unable to keep the panic from spilling out. "Claire knows, Ryan. She knows." His brows furrowed, his jaw tightening. "How could she know?" he asked, his voice low and disbelieving, as if the idea itself were inconceivable. "I don't know," I snapped, the frustration bubbling over. "But she does. And if she tells Jack—" "She won't," Ryan interrupted, his tone firm, resolute. "You don't know that." I fired back, my voice rising as panic clawed at my throat. "You don't understand how dangerous this is. Everything I've worked for, everything we've done. It could all come crashing down if she tells him." Ryan stepped closer, grabbing my hand with a steady but gentle grip. His touch was grounding, but his urgency was palpable. "Ellie," he said slowly, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't want to lose you." His words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. They caught me off guard, and for a moment all the walls I had built around myself wavered. "You won't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But we have to be more careful now, more than ever. For both our sakes." The days that followed were suffocating. Claire never said anything directly to Jack, at least, not that I could tell, but her lingering glances and the weight of her silent judgment made every encounter unbearable. Even Ryan, usually calm and confident, seemed shaken. His easy demeanor was replaced with a quiet tension that didn't escape my notice. Then one evening, everything unraveled. Jack came home earlier than expected, his footsteps echoing down the hallway at a time when I wasn't prepared for them. Ryan and I were in the laundry room, standing far closer than we should have been, our voices low but filled with a familiarity that couldn't be mistaken. The moment we heard the front door open, we both sprang apart, panic surging through me like electricity. "Ellie!" Jack's voice called out, sharp and clear, cutting through the air like a knife. "Here," I replied, forcing my voice to sound normal even as my heart hammered in my chest. Jack appeared in the doorway a moment later, his gaze sweeping the room. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of his eyes on me made my stomach twist into knots. For a split second I thought he might say something, but instead he nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on us both just a little too long. "Dinner's almost ready," I said quickly, plastering on a smile that felt brittle and wrong. My voice sounded strained even to my own ears. He didn't respond. He simply turned and left the room, but the look he gave me stayed with me long after he was gone. That night sleep was impossible. My mind replayed the scene over and over, the sharpness in Jack's eyes, the way his gaze lingered, the unmistakable tension in the air. It felt as though I was standing at the edge of a cliff, every second inching closer to the inevitable fall. And yet, despite the fear, despite the growing danger of discovery, I couldn't bring myself to end it. Whatever this was between Ryan and me, it had taken root too deeply, wrapped itself around too much of me. It was reckless, selfish, and utterly consuming, but I couldn't let go. Deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning to gather force. The next twist came out of nowhere. Jack came home early again, but this time it wasn't just the timing that unsettled me. His expression was tight, his jaw locked in a way I hadn't seen before, and the air around him carried a weight that made it hard to breathe. The moment he stepped inside, he dropped his briefcase to the floor with a thud that seemed to echo through the quiet house. A sound that felt like a warning shot. "Ryan!" Jack's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding, leaving no room for argument. Ryan appeared in the hallway almost instantly, his posture deceptively relaxed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He leaned casually against the wall, hands in his pockets, his tone light as he said, "What's up?" But there was an edge to his words, subtle but unmistakable. Jack didn't bother with pretense. His gaze narrowed as he took a deliberate step forward. "We need to talk. Now." Ryan shot me a brief glance, concerned, questioning, but he didn't hesitate. With measured steps he followed Jack into the living room, leaving me frozen in the kitchen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. At first, their voices were low, muffled by the walls, but the tension was impossible to miss. Jack's tone was sharp, accusatory, while Ryan's responses were steady but defensive. As the conversation escalated, the words started to cut through the barrier of sound. "I know what's been going on." Jack's voice was cold, each word hitting like a punch. Ryan's reply came quickly, his tone calm but strained. "What are you talking about? Don't play dumb with me," Jack snapped, his voice rising with barely contained rage. "I've seen the way you look at her. The way she looks at you. Do you think I'm blind?" My blood turned to ice. He knew, or at least he suspected enough to bring it up. "Jack, you're imagining things," Ryan said evenly, though there was a faint edge to his voice now, a crack in the calm exterior he was trying so hard to maintain. "There's nothing going on. Don't lie to me," Jack roared, and then came the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. The crash reverberated through the house, each shard of the broken object a reflection of the chaos unraveling around us. I couldn't stay hidden any longer. My legs moved on their own, carrying me to the doorway. I stood there, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps as I tried to steady myself. Both men turned to look at me, their expressions worlds apart. Jack's face was a storm of betrayal, fury, and heartbreak, while Ryan's eyes held a flicker of defiance beneath a layer of guilt. "Ellie," Jack said, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. It was the kind of calm that made my stomach churn. "Tell me the truth. Is there something going on between you two?" My mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence stretched unbearably, thick and suffocating. My inability to respond said more than I ever could have with words. Jack let out a bitter, humorless laugh, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I knew it," he muttered, his voice cracking. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I always knew. "Jack, please," I said softly, stepping forward, my hand reaching out instinctively as if I could somehow pull him back from the brink of what was happening. He held up a hand, the gesture sharp and final, stopping me in my tracks. "Don't," he said, his voice raw but firm. "Don't try to explain yourself. There's nothing you can say that will make this okay." His words were like a slap, each one stinging more than I thought possible. The room fell silent, save for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound that suddenly seemed unbearably loud, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, Jack turned to Ryan, his eyes blazing with barely restrained fury. "You're done here," he said coldly, his voice low but seething with anger. "Pack your things and leave tonight." Ryan's jaw tightened, his stance stiffening in defiance. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice calm but firm. Jack stepped closer, his voice rising with each word. "Yes, you are." The tension in the room felt like it might snap at any moment, and I stood there paralyzed, caught between the two of them as everything I had tried so hard to keep hidden was dragged out into the open. "You're not staying under my roof after this betrayal," Jack said, his voice trembling with rage. "Get your things and get out." Ryan's expression hardened, his posture stiffening as he straightened to his full height. I think you need to calm down, he said, his voice steady but firm. A statement that only seemed to pour gasoline on Jack's already blazing fury. Jack took a step closer, his fists clenched tight at his sides, his breathing ragged and uneven. Don't you dare tell me to calm down, you little. Stop it. I screamed, my voice cracking as I stepped between them, my body shaking under the weight of my emotions. Both of you, just stop. Jack's gaze shifted to me then, and the anger in his eyes was joined by something far more painful, hurt. Raw, unfiltered, soul-crushing hurt. How could you, Ellie? He asked, his voice a broken whisper, the words barely holding together. After everything I've done for you. I didn't mean for this to happen. I choked out, tears spilling over and blurring my vision. I never wanted to hurt you. Please believe me. Well, you did, Jack shot back, his words like daggers, sharp and bitter. And now I have to live with the fact that my own wife and... He stopped, his voice catching as though he couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. Instead, he shook his head, his disbelief and devastation written all over his face. I can't even say it. It's too much. Ryan reached for my hand then, a silent attempt to offer comfort, but I pulled away as if his touch burned. It felt like a betrayal in itself, especially with Jack standing right there watching every move. I think it's best if I leave, Ryan said finally, his voice quieter now, but carrying a weight of finality that made my heart ache. Jack didn't even look at him. Instead, his gaze locked on me, his expression hardening into something unrecognizable. You're not going anywhere, Jack declared, his tone icy and resolute. This is my house, and if anyone is leaving, it's him. Jack, I started, my voice trembling, but he cut me off with a sharp wave of his hand. No, he said, his words trembling with barely contained fury. I don't want to hear it. You made your choice, Ellie. Now you'll live with the consequences. That night, Ryan packed his things. He moved with a mechanical precision, his actions almost robotic, as though he had shut himself off from the reality of the situation. I followed him to the driveway, my chest heavy, each step dragging me closer to an unbearable goodbye. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't stop them if I tried. Ryan turned to face me, and his expression softened in a way I wasn't expecting. There was sorrow there, yes, but also determination. This isn't over, he said, his voice steady, almost reassuring. You know that, right? I nodded, unable to speak. I wanted to believe him. More than anything I did, but deep down doubt clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I stood there, frozen, as his car disappeared down the street, its taillights vanishing into the night. My heart twisted painfully in my chest, and I was left standing in the cold, consumed by a cocktail of guilt, regret, and something darker. Something I couldn't quite name but that left me hollow. The days that followed were unbearable. Jack refused to speak to me, his silence heavier than any words could have been. It was a punishment I felt in my bones. I threw myself into chores, scrubbing every surface, folding every piece of laundry, anything to keep my hands busy. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't quiet the gnawing emptiness inside me. Then a week later a letter arrived. There was no return address, just my name scrawled across the envelope in Ryan's familiar handwriting. My hand shook as I opened it, my heart hammering against my ribcage. Ellie, I know things are complicated right now, but I need you to understand that I meant every word. This isn't over. I don't care what anyone else says. I can't just walk away from you, and I won't. When you're ready, I'll be here waiting. Always. Ryan. I read it 3 times, each word settling into me like a weight I couldn't carry. Part of me wanted to tear it up, to shred the evidence of what we had done, to make it disappear and pretend it never happened. But another part of me, the part one didn't want to admit existed, clung to those words. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the back of my dresser drawer, hiding it like the secret I wasn't ready to face. Because deep down I knew Ryan was right. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.